In the summer of 1944, the most powerful nations on Earth gathered at Air Resort Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. 44 countries, 44 finance ministers, 44 agendas, and one problem. After the most expensive war in human history, who was going to control the money? They argued for 3 weeks, and then the answer became obvious, because it was the only answer that made sense. The United States had emerged from the war as the world's largest economy, its largest creditor, and the only country with meaningful gold reserves. They built the global financial system around the dollar, every currency pegged to the dollar. The dollar pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. Clean, elegant, logical. It lasted 27 years. On August 15, 1971, Richard Nixon went on television and told the world the deal was off. The United States would no longer convert dollars to gold. Just like that, the foundation of the entire global monetary system evaporated. Every central bank on Earth was now holding reserves backed by nothing but American promises. The world had a problem, and Henry Kissinger had a solution. What happened next was kept secret for 42 years. Today we are going to do the full autopsy. We are going to decode the trap Kissinger built in 1974. Why it had no exit clause by design, and why the countries who think they are escaping it in 2026 are still quietly inside it. Welcome to Financial Autopsy. To understand what Kissinger built, you have to understand what Nixon destroyed. The Bretton Woods system was, by the standards of international finance, almost beautiful in its simplicity. Every major currency was pegged to the US dollar. The dollar was pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. If you were a foreign government and you had accumulated too many dollars, you could walk up to the window of the US Treasury and exchange them for gold. That was the promise. That was the floor. It worked remarkably well for about 2 decades. American exports flooded world markets. The dollar became the universal language of trade. Countries held dollars, not because they had to, but because dollars were as good as gold, literally. And then, America started spending money it did not have. The Vietnam War cost roughly $140 billion over 2 decades. And that is the direct military cost, not counting the broader economic distortions. Lyndon Johnson's Great Society domestic programs ran simultaneously. The United States was running both a warfare state and a welfare state. At the same time, financing both on credit and the rest of the world was beginning to notice. By the late 1960s, the gold window was becoming a problem. France, and it is always France, began converting its dollar reserves into physical gold in large quantities. French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing had already given the arrangement a name that would stick in the history books. He called American monetary privilege an exorbitant privilege. The idea was simple. The United States could print dollars, spend them around the world, accumulate debts, and because those dollars were the global reserve currency, everyone else was forced to absorb them. France wanted no part of it. Other countries started watching France. The gold drain accelerated. By 1971, the numbers had become genuinely alarming. The United States held roughly $10 billion worth of gold reserves. Foreign governments held roughly $80 billion in claims against those reserves. The math was not difficult. If even a fraction of those governments decided to convert simultaneously. The U.S. Treasury did not have enough gold to honor the commitments. Nixon's Treasury Secretary, John Connally, summarized the American position with a candor that diplomatic circles still quote. Today, he told a group of European finance ministers, "The dollar is our currency, but it's your problem." Think about the audacity of that. On August 15, 1971, Nixon went on television during prime time and announced what became known as Nixon's shock. The gold window was closed, unilaterally, without negotiation, without warning. The Smithsonian Agreement in December 1971 tried to patch things together with a new system of fixed exchange rates. But that only lasted 14 months before currencies went back to floating. The world's monetary system was now, for the first time since World War II, running without a foundation. No gold, no fixed rates, no anchor. Every country that had been holding dollars was now holding a currency backed by nothing more than confidence in American institutions. Its confidence in American institutions in 1991 was, charitably not, at its historical peak. Nixon was in the White House. Vietnam was still ongoing. The economy was producing inflation at rates not seen in decades. The dollar needed a new reason to exist as the world's reserve currency, and it needed one fast. In the next section, we are going to look at exactly how Henry Kissinger solved that problem, and why the solution he chose was specifically designed to be impossible to undo. Henry Kissinger understood power the way a surgeon understands anatomy. Could look at a geopolitical situation, identify the pressure points, and apply exactly the right amount of force at exactly the right location. Had spent his academic career studying the mechanics of the concert of Europe, the 19th century system that had kept the great powers in equilibrium for a century. Doctoral dissertation was about Metternich. This matters because what Kissinger built in 1974 was not a deal. It was a system, Metternich style, web of interlocking incentives, so carefully constructed that no single actor could unravel it without paying an impossible price. To understand the opportunity Kissinger saw, you need to understand what the 1973 oil shock actually did to the world. On October 6, 1973, Egypt and Syria launched coordinated surprise attack against Israel on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish calendar. Nixon and Kissinger, viewing the conflict through the lens of Cold War competition with the Soviet Union, organized Operation Nickel Grass, a massive emergency airlift of military equipment to resupply the Israeli defense forces. It was decisive, and the Arab members of OPEC responded with a weapon they had been theorizing about for years. They imposed an oil embargo on the United States and every country that had supported Israel, and they cut production simultaneously. The results were convulsive. In the United States, petrol queues stretched for blocks. Speed limits were slashed to 55 miles per hour to conserve fuel. Daylight saving time was extended. Nixon appeared on television urging Americans to turn down their thermostats and switch off their Christmas lights. A barrel of oil went from under $3 to nearly $12 in months. The oil shock did two things simultaneously that are rarely discussed together. It devastated the economies of oil-importing nations. Inflation spiked. Recession followed. The combination, stagflation, became the defining economic pathology of the 1970s. Second, and this is the part nobody focuses on, it made the Gulf states extraordinarily, almost embarrassingly wealthy. Countries like Saudi Arabia's suddenly found themselves accumulating dollars faster than they could conceivably spend them. Their domestic economies were too small to absorb the inflows. They needed somewhere to put the money. Kissinger saw this immediately for what it was: not a crisis, an opportunity. In his own strategic framing, documented in detail by historians, his objective was explicit. Instead of trying to reduce Gulf financial power, the United States would capture it. The Gulf states had demonstrated they could weaponize oil. The counter-move was not to reduce American oil dependence. That would take decades, and was a political impossibility in the short term. Counter-move was to ensure that the enormous financial power the oil price spike had Gulf has was embedded in the American system before it could be deployed against it. About the architecture of that. It was not defensive. It was not reactive. It was a deliberate act of financial acquisition, using the only currency the United States had in unlimited supply in 1974, military power and security guarantees. In June of 1974, Kissinger and Treasury Secretary William Simon flew to Riyadh. They met with King Faisal bin Abdulaziz Al Saud and Saudi Finance Minister Mohammed Al-Khail over several days of meetings that were, at the time, not widely publicized. On June 8, 1974, Kissinger and Crown Prince signed a joint statement in Washington establishing two formal commissions, one economic, one military, framing the relationship as a broad cooperation agreement. This was the public framework. Before 1974, Saudi Arabia had been pricing oil in British pounds. 20% of global oil was still transacted in sterling. By 1976, that number had fallen to 6%. The pound simply stopped being relevant to the global oil trade. Saudi Arabia had come to an understanding. The formal signing was not the real deal. The real deal was separate, and it was secret. And in the next section, we are going to look at exactly what was agreed, and why it was kept classified for 42 years. The June 8, 1974 signing ceremony was real. The joint commissions were real. The economic cooperation framework was real. But the actual mechanism, the financial architecture that would underpin the global monetary system for the next half-century, was a separate arrangement concluded later in 1974, and it was classified. The existence of this agreement was not publicly confirmed until 2016. Not by a whistleblower, not by a leak, by a Freedom of Information Act request filed by Bloomberg News with the U.S. National Archives. 42 years after the handshake, journalists had to file legal paperwork to confirm that the deal existed. That is not an accident. It was designed that way. The terms, as documented from those declassified records, were as follows. The United States would provide Saudi Arabia with military aid, military equipment, and an implicit security guarantee the commitment of American power to the defense of the Saudi state against external threats. In return, Saudi Arabia would take its surplus oil revenues and invest them in US Treasury bonds and other dollar-denominated assets. That was it. Oil money in, Treasury bonds out. Dollars cycling back to Washington. America's ability to borrow cheaply maintained. By early 1975, Saudi Arabia had purchased $2.5 billion worth of U.S. treasuries. Through a process that declassified documents reveal was deliberately structured outside the normal auction process, at preferential rates, in a way that was not visible to other market participants. The Saudis were buying American debt in secret, at terms unavailable to anyone else, as part of an arrangement that the U.S. Treasury itself kept confidential. Jerry Parsky, who served as deputy to Treasury Secretary Simon during those negotiations, reflected on it decades later with a candor that is worth sitting with. I said the secret arrangement with the Saudis should have been dismantled years ago, and that he was surprised the Treasury kept it in place. Think about what that means. One of the architects of the deal thought it outlived its justification, and the Treasury kept running it anyway, for decades, without public knowledge or congressional scrutiny. Meanwhile, the other OPEC nations were watching Saudi Arabia. They saw what the arrangement looked like from the outside: military protection, guaranteed marketed for oil, a preferred relationship with the world's dominant power. The incentives were obvious. By 1975, 1 year after the Kissinger-Fard meetings, every OPEC nation had agreed to price oil in US dollars and hold surplus revenues in US government debt securities. Everyone, not because Washington had negotiated with each of them individually, not because there was a multilateral treaty, because the incentives were structured so clearly that the rational choice for every oil exporting trio independently was to join the dollar system. That is what makes it a trap rather than an agreement. A trap does not need walls. It just needs to make every other option worse. King Faisal, the Saudi king who authorized the deal, was assassinated by his own nephew in March 1975, 8 months after the arrangement was concluded. He never saw the full consequences of what he had agreed to. Ahmed Zaki Yamani, the Saudi oil minister and the public face of OPEC's power throughout the 1970s, spent years managing the political tensions between Arab nationalism and the financial logic of the petrodollar system. Political cost of the arrangement, dependency on American military power, the implicit subordination of Saudi foreign policy to Washington's strategic interests, was real and was felt. But the money was also real, and money, as Kissinger understood better than most, tends to win. The term for what he had constructed was coined by Kissinger himself: petrodollar recycling. Oil exporters earn dollars. Dollars flow back into American debt. America can borrow cheaply. America buys more oil. Dollars flow back to oil exporters. Loop repeats. It is a closed system. It is self-reinforcing. And it was specifically designed without a formal treaty, without a legal document that could be cancelled, renegotiated, or expired. Because Kissinger knew that the most durable trap is one where the prisoner helps maintain the walls. In the next section, we are going to look at exactly how the recycling machine worked in practice, and how it became the invisible engine of American financial dominance for 5 decades. Understand what the petrodollar system actually did. You need to follow the money through its full circuit, because the circuit is the point. Here is the loop. Saudi Arabia, or Kuwait, or the UAE, or any Gulf state, pumps oil out of the ground. They sell it. Dollars flow in, more dollars than any domestic economy can possibly absorb. Saudi Arabia, in the mid-1970s, had a population of roughly 7 million people. There is a limit to how many hospitals, schools, and infrastructure projects a country of 7 million can build before it runs out of viable domestic investments. Now, the surplus dollars need to go somewhere. They go into US Treasury bonds, into American equities, into real estate, into the global banking system, where they are lent out, often to developing countries that need to buy oil and dollars to do it, and they're recycled again. The process is continuous. It does not stop when oil prices fall slightly. It does not stop when individual governments change. It is structural. What this did for the United States was extraordinary. It created what French Finance Minister Giscard d'Estaing had called, even before the petrodollar system existed, an exorbitant privilege. After 1974, that privilege became structural rather than incidental. The mechanism works like this. Because oil is priced in dollars, any country that wants to buy oil on international markets has to first acquire dollars. Japan needs oil. Japan must buy dollars. Germany needs oil. Germany must buy dollars. China, India, Brazil, Indonesia, any country running an industrializing economy that requires energy must maintain dollar reserves simply to participate in the global energy market. That demand for dollars is not driven by confidence in American fiscal policy. It is not driven by admiration for American institutions. It is driven by the structural fact that the world's most essential commodity is priced in one currency, and you need that currency to function. By the mid-1970s, 90% of all foreign exchange trades involved the US dollar. 60% of global foreign exchange reserves were held in dollars. 40% of all global debt was denominated in dollars. Those are not numbers produced by American competitiveness alone. Those are numbers produced by the architecture Kissinger built. And the consequence for America was the ability to do something no other country on earth could do: run persistent budget deficits without triggering a debt crisis. Here is what that means in practice. When a country like Greece or Argentina runs large deficits, interest rates on their debt rise. Investors demand a premium for the risk. The country is forced to cut spending or raise taxes, or both. The adjustment is painful and visible. When the United States runs large deficits, oil exporting nations and foreign central banks buy more treasuries because they need to park their dollar surpluses somewhere. And US treasuries remain the deepest and most liquid market in the world. The additional demand keeps yields lower than they would otherwise be. The US government can borrow more cheaply. The adjustment never comes. That is the exorbitant privilege in its operational form. By the 1980s, the recycling machine had become self-sustaining in ways its architects had not fully anticipated. Petrodollar surpluses were flowing to American and European commercial banks, which were in turn lending heavily to Latin American governments that needed dollars for development and oil imports. Brazil, Argentina, Mexico all accumulated enormous dollar-denominated debt in the 1970s on the assumption that dollar interest rates would remain manageable. When the Federal Reserve raised rates aggressively in the early 1980s to combat inflation, those countries found themselves holding crushing debt loads in a currency they did not control. The Latin American debt crisis of the 1980s was, in significant part, a downstream consequence of petrodollar recycling. The machine worked for the United States. It worked less well for the countries on its periphery. But this is the aspect that is almost never discussed when people talk about the petrodollar system. The machine was not designed to be reversible. Kissinger had not built a treaty. He had built a system, and systems do not have expiry date. This should prompt a quick pause, because if you have found this breakdown useful, the subscribe button and the like are what tell the algorithm this channel is worth recommending. We are going to keep going, because in the next section we are going to look at what happens when countries decide they want out, and why getting out turns out to be considerably harder than it appears. Petrodollar system was never universally believed. From the moment it was established, countries with grievances against American foreign policy understood what it meant. To participate in the global oil market was to finance the United States government. Every dollar spent on imported oil was a dollar that would eventually make its way back into an American Treasury bond. There was no separating the two. The countries that tried to opt out did not fare well. This is not a coincidence. Iraq under Saddam Hussein announced in 2000 that it would switch its oil transactions from dollars to euros. The euro was, at that point, a relatively new currency with genuine potential to serve as an alternative reserve currency. Saddam's stated rationale was political, opposition to American policy, but the financial logic was also real. The euro was appreciating against the dollar, and euro-denominated oil revenues would have been worth more in purchasing power terms. By February 2003, Iraq had converted its UN oil for food reserves to euros. In March 2003, the United States invaded Iraq. You can draw your own conclusions about causality. The official justification was weapons of mass destruction. The weapons were not found. The oil ministry was among the first. Buildings secured by coalition forces after the fall of Baghdad. Iraqi oil exports returned to dollar pricing. Libya under Muammar Gaddafi spent years advocating for an African gold currency, the gold dinar, that would allow African oil exporters to price their exports outside the dollar system entirely. The proposal was not trivial. Libya held considerable gold reserves and had genuine influence in African Union discussions. In 2011, a NATO-backed coalition intervened in a Libyan civil war. Gaddafi was killed. The gold dinar project ended. Iran has operated outside the dollar system under sanctions for decades. The result is an economy that has been, by various measures, cut off from significant portions of international trade, unable to access the swift financial messaging system for extended periods, and subject to an asset freeze that, at various points, locked up tens of billions of dollars in overseas holdings. Venezuela attempted to establish a petrocurrency, the petro, backed by its oil reserves. The petro has not become a significant factor in international trade. The pattern is consistent enough to be worth examining without claiming a single cause. The countries that have most visibly attempted to move their oil trade outside the dollar system have, without exception, experienced significant political and economic difficulty. Whether that difficulty is the cause, the consequence, or simply the context of their currency. Experiments is a question historians will debate. The correlation, however, is observable. The more interesting question, the one that gets to the real hidden mechanism of the petrodollar system is why even the countries with the political will and the economic weight to challenge the system have found it so difficult. The answer is network effects. Network effects are why English became the language of international business, even for countries that have perfectly functional languages of their own. The more people use a thing, the more valuable it becomes to use that thing, which makes more people use it, which makes it more valuable. The dollar's position in global trade is not maintained primarily by American military power. It is maintained by the fact that every buyer, every seller, every swap desk, every futures exchange, every derivative contract in the global oil market is denominated in dollars. To move away from the dollar requires not just your own agreement, but the agreement of every counterparty you want to trade with. China has been building the infrastructure for an alternative. The Shanghai International Energy Exchange launched yuan-denominated oil futures in 2018. China's CIPS payment system now has connections to financial institutions in over 100 countries. 2025, China's CIPS network settled the equivalent of 245 trillion yuan in transactions. The number's large, but the dollar is still on one side of 89.2% of all foreign exchange transactions, according to the Bank for International Settlements 2025 survey. That number is up from 88.4% in 2022. The dollar's operational dominance in actual currency trading is not declining, it is increasing. Think about the irony of that. The country that the world is supposedly escaping is more embedded in global financial transactions in 2025 than it was 3 years ago. The trap Kissinger built is not loosening, it is tightening. In the next section, we are going to look at the actual data, because there are two sets of numbers circulating about the petrodollar system right now, and they tell completely opposite stories. Almost everyone discussing this topic is only looking at one of them. In June 2024, the internet briefly lost its mind. Reports circulated, widely shared, widely believed, that Saudi Arabia had allowed its petrodollar agreement with the United States to expire. The story spread across financial media, social platforms and YouTube channels with considerable velocity. The petrodollar was dead. The dollar was finished. Gold was going to $10,000. The American empire was over. Paul Donovan, the chief economist at UBS Global Wealth Management, assessed the story directly. He called it fake news. There had been an agreement signed in June of 1974, he noted, but it had never been about oil pricing in dollars because the Saudis had continued selling oil in British pounds after the signing, at least for a period. The viral story had conflated the public cooperation framework with the separate, later secret arrangement. The Eurasia Group analyst Gregory Brew similarly found no evidence supporting the claim that a formal petrodollar pricing agreement had expired. Saudi Arabia did decline to formally renew the arrangement. That is real. What is also real is that in December 2025, Saudi Arabia held $149.5 billion in U.S. Treasury securities. That figure was $12 billion higher than the year before. Saudi Arabia did not renew the agreement in June 2024 and then spent the following year buying more American debt. This is the first set of numbers. the one that supports the petrodollar is dying narrative. The US dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has fallen from a peak of 72% in 2001 to roughly 56.9% in the third quarter of 2025. That is a real decline. It is the lowest level since 1995. Over 2 decades, the dollar's share of central bank reserves has dropped by roughly 15 percentage points. That number is real. It is significant. It is the one in every dollarization headline you have ever read. Here is the number that does not appear in those headlines. The IMF, after examining the data behind that reserve decline, found that roughly 92% of the quarterly decline recorded in mid-2025 was driven by exchange rate movements. The dollar weakened. That made non-dollar holdings appear larger in dollar terms. Central banks were not, in any meaningful volume, actively selling dollars and buying alternatives. A decline in reserve share was mostly a mathematical artifact of currency movements, not a policy decision. Now add the second number. The Chinese yuan accounts for roughly 2% of global foreign exchange reserves as of 2025. Up from approximately 1% in 2020, the yuan's share has doubled 2% against dollars 56.9%. Russia and China now conduct roughly 90% of their bilateral trade in yuan and rubles. That is real. But Russia and China bilateral trade is a fraction of global trade volume. When you zoom out to the full BIS survey of actual foreign exchange transactions, the dollar's share is 89.2%, up from 88.4% in 2022. The system is more dollar-dependent in 2026 than it was in 2000, despite everything. Despite BRICS expansion, despite yuan oil futures, despite them bridge CBDC platform and China's CPS network, despite Trump's tariffs creating Sell America sentiment, despite the US national debt reaching $39 trillion, roughly $3 billion per day in interest payments, 39 trillion in total obligations. Think about the architecture of that. A second CTA because the algorithm needs signals. And you have made it this far if this channel is giving you frameworks for reading economic news, that the headlines missubscribe, and leave a comment on which economy you want to topseed next. The US is adding debt at a rate of approximately $7 billion per day. Interest payments in fiscal year 2025 reached $1.2 trillion. For the first time in American history, the government spent more in interest on its debt than on defense. And yet the dollar's operational dominance in global currency markets is rising. The trap Kissinger built in 1974 is still working exactly as designed, but here is where it gets genuinely interesting. Because what Kissinger built was designed to be self-sustaining, and self-sustaining systems eventually develop their own internal contradictions. In the next section, we are going to look at the two numbers that tell opposite stories about the petrodollar's future, and why the truth is more uncomfortable than either the bulls or the bears want to admit. There are two numbers at the center of every petrodollar argument, and they contradict each other so directly that most analysts simply pick the one that fits their conclusion and ignore the other. Number one, the dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has fallen from 72% in 2001 to 56.9% in 2025, a 15 percentage point decline over 24 years. Number 2. The dollar is present on one side of 89.2% of all actual foreign exchange transactions as of the BIS 2025 triennial survey, up from 88.4% in 2022. These two numbers appear to be in direct contradiction. One says the dollar is losing, the other says the dollar is winning. Both are accurate. Both come from credible institutions with full access to the underlying data. How do you hold them simultaneously? Here is the resolution. Reserve share measures what central banks choose to hold as a store of value. It is a slow, deliberate, policy-driven decision made by finance ministries and central bank governors. Yes, over 2 decades, central banks have been gradually diversifying, adding euros, Canadian dollars, Australian dollars, Swiss francs, some yuan. The diversification is real. It is slow. It is nowhere near the scale the headlines suggest. But it is happening. Transaction share measures what actually happens when money moves across borders. When a Korean company buys oil from Saudi Arabia, the transaction goes through a dollar swap. When a Brazilian exporter converts revenue, the dominant vehicle is dollars. When a Vietnamese manufacturer pays for components from a supplier in a different currency, the pricing benchmark is dollars. The dollar is not just a reserve currency. It is the operational language of global commerce. These are not the same thing, and the difference between them explains why every prediction about the dollar's imminent collapse has been wrong for 50 years. Currencies lose reserve status slowly, and they lose it last. They lose it transaction dominance even more slowly, because transaction dominance is embedded in contracts, in derivatives, in institutional infrastructure, in the fact that every major commodity exchange on earth prices in dollars. You do not switch the operating language of the global economy the way you switch a phone contract. The comparison that keeps appearing in serious economic literature is to the British pound. Pound began losing reserve status to the dollar after World War I. It was not fully displaced as the primary reserve currency until the mid-1950s, roughly 3 decades later. And British economic decline was substantially more severe than America's current position. The UK emerged from World War II as a debtor nation, having liquidated most of its foreign assets to finance the war. The United States, in 2026, is the world's largest economy, largest military spender, and the issuer of the primary reserve currency. The de-dollarization story is real. The timeline being attached to it is not. David White, author of Oil Money, Middle East Petrodollars, and the Transformation of U.S. Empire, has made this point with precision. Pricing oil in dollars, he argues, is not fundamentally what makes the dollar powerful in global trade. The power of the dollar in global trade is why most oil is priced in dollars. The causality runs in the opposite direction from the way most de-dollarization narratives frame it. Which means that even if Saudi Arabia tomorrow announced it was pricing all its oil in yuan, a scenario that remains as of 2026, the structural dollar dominance in global trade would not immediately collapse. It would be a significant signal. It would accelerate diversification at the margins. It would not be the binary event that financial YouTube tends to present it as. Here is what actually threatens the system. Not BRICS, not the yuan, not oil pricing decisions by individual countries. The actual threat to the petrodollar system is the same threat that killed Bretton Woods. It is the United States itself. The system Kissinger built rested on one foundation: confidence that American institutions had the fiscal discipline, the political credibility to make the dollar worth holding. When Nixon destroyed that confidence in 1971 by closing the gold window unilaterally, it took a decade of financial architecture to rebuild it in a different form. The petrodollar system was that architecture. The U.S. national debt is now approximately $39 trillion. The government is spending roughly $1.2 trillion per year on interest alone. The debt-to-GDP ratio is approaching the all-time American record set in 1946, immediately after financing the most expensive war in human history. The Congressional Budget Office projects the net cost of interest on the national debt will reach $1.04 trillion for fiscal year 2026. That is $7,700 per American household just to cover the interest. Not the debt, the interest. The irony, and it is a very specific kind of irony, is that their petrodollar system is currently financing the very debt load that, if it becomes unmanageable, would be the thing that finally breaks the petrodollar system. Foreign central banks and oil exporters are buying U.S. triassiata. Allow the U.S. to run the deficits that are creating the debt that eventually threatens the creditworthiness that makes those treasuries worth buying. The trap Kissinger built has a second layer, and America is inside it too. Final thoughts. So, what have we actually learned? 1. The petrodollar system was not created by a treaty. It was created by a web of interlocking incentives, deliberately designed without an Ekitstaat clause, kept secret for 42 years, and only confirmed through a Freedom of Information request in 2016. The petrodollar agreement expired. Headlines of 2024 were based on a misunderstanding of what the system actually is. 2. The recycling mechanism, oil dollars, flowing back into U.S. treasuries, keeping American borrowing costs artificially low, enabling persistent deficits, became self-sustaining within a decade of its creation. It was not maintained by American strength alone. It was maintained by the fact that every country that needed oil needed dollars, and every country that accumulated dollars needed somewhere to park them. 3. The countries that tried to exit the system, Iraq, Libya, Venezuela, Iran, experienced outcomes that range from difficult to catastrophic. The correlation is consistent, even if the causality is disputed. 4. The two numbers that dominate the de-dollarization debate tell opposite stories. Reserve share is falling slowly. Transaction dominance is rising. Both are true. The dollar is not dying. It is evolving its grip. 5. The actual threat to the system is internal. A $39 trillion debt, $1.2 trillion in annual interest payments, and a debt-to-GDP ratio approaching post-World War II records. The petrodollar system is currently financing the debt load that at some threshold would break it. The verdict of this autopsy: the petrodollar system is not collapsing. It is contradicting itself. And systems that contradict themselves do not collapse suddenly. They hollow out slowly over decades until the day the weight becomes too much. And then the collapse, when it finally arrives, looks sudden to everyone who was not paying attention. If you want to understand what replaces the dollar when that day comes, or whether anything replaces it at all, the next video is going to look at the history of reserve currency transitions, how long they actually take, and what the countries caught in the middle pay for the disruption. Like this video if the autopsy added something to your thinking. Subscribe if you want the real mechanisms, not the press release version. The deal was secret for 42 years. The world is still inside it. Nobody noticed.